Continuing our discussion of ethos, we want to now consider 5 prominent features of style that affect voice and distance. We've been talking about rhetorical distance, and this part of ethos really discusses the way language affects the perception of your audience of the distance between yourself and them. As I mentioned, you have to consider what is appropriate for a given situation, a given rhetorical situation. What distance is appropriate? How intimate can you afford to be with your audience? How much do you want them to identify with you as speaker as opposed to your subject matter? Do you want to emphasize the material, or do you want to emphasize yourself as speaker presenting the material? Not to say you're promoting yourself, but that's what distance has to do with, is how much of yourself is present in what you're saying. There are times where you don't want to be present in what you're saying. You don't want that to be your presence to be felt. There are other times where you want to be, and obviously so. It is important and necessary that you connect with your audience. Language affects that. There are plenty of other things we have not discussed at all. Eye contact, we've not discussed body language, but certainly those things will create distance or help your audience to identify with you, and those things are available to you in spoken discourse, not in written discourse. But we will talk about some of that a little bit later. Let's talk about the 5 prominent features of style. The first is grammatical person. Grammatical person. Modern day speech and composition courses often restrict students to third person when it comes to essays, research papers, and that sort of thing. There is a place for third person, and I think it is important. It's an important skill for you to learn to write exclusively in third person. It's difficult to do, as you no doubt are aware. It is not rhetorically effective in every case. And I guess I would argue that discourse should not be so limited. Again, you need to learn to write that way, and it's good that teachers assign you to write that way. But you also need to understand the way third person affects the distance, rhetorical distance, as opposed to first or second person. Third person discourse is designed to be objective, and the more a student nominalizes and the more faithfully he uses third person, the more he removes himself from the rhetorical situation so that his presence is not felt. So third person is the realm of objectivity. First person is the realm of subjective opinion. And second person is the realm of instruction. Now we want you in rhetoric to learn to use the appropriate person to consider the situation and develop your speech using the right person to develop the right sense, the right feel to what you're saying. So let's take each person in turn. First person discourse is the most intimate person. First person decreases distance the most and allows your audience to identify with you, the speaker. Now there's a reason why first person does this. And the first thing is that it tells the audience that someone is involved. Someone is speaking personally, and that someone who is speaking is me. So first person discourse makes the audience feel spoken to. It can give a sense of honesty, because in first person discourse the author takes responsibility for the opinions he expresses and the positions he takes. I have a great example of first person discourse taken from David Copperfield. I'll just read to you from Sharon Crowley's record of it. The opening lines in Charles Dickens' great book, David Copperfield. The book begins, "Whether I shall turn out to be the hero of my own life, or whether that station will be held by anybody else, these pages must show. To begin my life with the beginning of my life, I record that I was born." And, of course, he continues. But you get the sense that you're being spoken to by Dickens, or in this case by Copperfield, who is recording his fictitious autobiography. Many believe that David Copperfield is Charles Dickens' autobiography of what he wished his life would have been. But nonetheless, you feel a connection to the author immediately. And there's a use of I there that is friendly, that is open, that is cozy, if you will. That's honest. On the other hand, a glaring fault with the first person is that it often comes across as egocentric. Let me read to you another example that may sound a little bit arrogant to you. This is taken from Fyodor Dostoevsky's Underground Man. And it goes like this. "I am a sick man. I am a spiteful man. I am an unpleasant man. I think my liver is diseased. However, I don't know beans about my disease, and I am not sure what is bothering me. I don't treat it and never have, though I respect medicine and doctors. Besides, I am extremely superstitious. Let's say sufficiently so to respect medicine. I am educated enough not to be superstitious, but I am. No, I refuse to treat it out of spite. You probably will not understand that. Well, but I understand it. Of course, I can't explain to you just whom I am annoying in this case by my spite." Now there's an example of first-person discourse that comes across as a little bit arrogant, a little bit self-centered there. And that is a typical response to an overuse of first-person discourse. When you say I too much, people think you're proud. If you want the cozy feel of first person without sounding arrogant, you might consider substituting first person plural for first person singular. So instead of saying I, say we. We don't like it this way. Listen to that passage again, but using we. We are a sick man. We are a spiteful man. We are an unpleasant man. We think our liver is diseased. However, we don't know beans about our disease, and we are not sure what is bothering us. Now that sounds funny and awkward, all right? But it shows you the way first person plural can be used in order to speak of yourself without sounding arrogant. And to also, and really a better way would be to do it in a case where you want to say your opinion, but you want other people to identify with you. All right, so the first person plural makes the audience feel involved in the discussion and can actually increase identification even more than I. Listen to this passage. The passage I just read probably is a little awkward using the we, but here's another example of the first person being used in a cozier way than the word I. Listen. All right, guys, listen up. It hasn't been our century, has it? We kinda blew it, didn't we? Even though you don't know exactly what I'm talking about, you kinda know what I'm talking about, don't you? Haven't you had that morning where you wake up, look around, and go, do I have to do this again? And maybe you can't describe exactly what it is that's missing, but something is missing, right? I'm here to tell you what's missing. Your ancient spear is missing. Obviously, I don't mean that you need to go out and buy a spear. If it was that easy, I'd be selling you a spear. Instead, I'm selling you a book. No, I'm not. What I'm talking about is something deeper, much deeper than a plain wooden spear, or one of those spears with a lot of feathers hanging off it, like Cochise had. Yes, what I'm talking about is richer than that, richer even than Michael and Sarah's spear. I'm talking about the golden spear that lies at the bottom of the soggy, gooey lake. We men fought an entire war in Europe so that a new man could emerge in America, and what did we end up with? Ward Cleaver. Give me a break. Let's face it, it's been all downhill since then, hasn't it? We're weenies. We've been weenies. Women have known this for a long time. Now this is taken from a book review, a review of the book that is called, let's see, it's written by Joe Bob Briggs, and I believe, I can't find it, but it's something about recovering the ancient spear. Anyway, it's a passage taken from Sharon Crowley's book, so I'll give that credit. But I want to make a few comments about his use of the first person. First of all, even as you listen to the passage, it's easy to identify with the writer. He reduces distance a number of ways, starting with the conspiratorial we. He also speaks to men as if they are already in on the secret, as if they already know what he's talking about, even if they don't know what he's talking about. And that also makes us feel involved, like we were a part of the whole thing. He uses allusion very well as well. He demonstrates really respect for his audience because he assumes that the audience knows who Cochise is, who Michael and Sarah is. Michael and Sarah played Cochise in the TV series Broken Arrow. And he assumes that we all know who Ward Cleaver is. Leave it to Beaver claim. We leave it to Beaver fame, not claim. He used short sentences, questions, colloquialisms like "give me a break," all for the sake of using a plain style, helping the audience to identify with him by pretending that the audience already identifies with him. Of course, the use of we can have a pitfall, and that pitfall is probably more apparent to the young ladies than it is to the young men. The girls listening or watching, the young ladies watching this lecture, might be able to say exactly what the problem with the use of we is. If you are not a part of the we, and if it becomes increasingly apparent that you're not included in that we, then the we becomes exclusive rather than inclusive. So the question is, who are you writing for? That's what you need to consider. All right, let's consider second person. If you use first person, you will find it difficult not to use second person. Second person is often used in advertising and in instruction manuals. Consider this ad from an old New York Life advertisement. We weren't always old and conservative. We used to be young and conservative. Call your New York Life agent. Now, of course, the first two lines are intended to lead to the last line. Call your New York Life agent. You might recognize the second person in that imperative statement. Notice the use of we, which is not meant to be cozy in this case so much as collective and distinct from other insurance companies. Now, let's consider some other advertising jingles, like Eat Fresh, Think Outside the Bun, Have It Your Way, Come Fly the Friendly Skies, Sprite's advertisement, Obey Your Thirst, Southwest, You are now free to move about the country, Almond Joy, Sometimes you feel like a nut, sometimes you don't. And Allstate's commercial advertisement, you're in good hands. All of those employ the second person. Notice that these slogans do have a cozy feel to them. They're inviting you to come be a participant. They help you to identify with the product. The pitfall of second person is that often it is imperative. It's used in the imperative. And so second person discourse can sound bossy. Notice again the slogans, because all of them were giving orders. Eat fresh. Now you don't feel like you're being ordered to eat fresh, but yet in a sense you are. You're being compelled. Sprite, obey your thirst. Well, but my thirst says I want to drink water or Mountain Dew or Coke or something besides Sprite, which I rarely choose. But nonetheless, I'm being told to obey my thirst and drink Sprite. But you might not notice, and here's the genius of some of these jingles. What you don't notice is the bossy sound. You are being told what to do. You're being told to have it your way, which would not be having your way if you're doing it because you're told to be. But you don't notice that it's bossy because it feels personal to you. It has a cozy enough feel to it. When we read instruction manuals, we don't mind the bossy tone because that's why we're reading the instruction manual. We want to be told what to do. So you need to be mindful of these pitfalls of the second person. When you use second person, you do need to pay attention to whether or not you sound like you're giving orders. Be aware of that. By the way, notice the bossy tone of the last sentence. And, for that matter, this sentence where I told you to notice. So it's not always bad to use a bossy tone. You just need to be aware that you might be sounding bossy. People don't mind, and in fact, you might not have minded the bossy tone because I'm your teacher and I'm instructing you, giving you instruction, so you expect that. You might need to tone it down a little bit if you're a peer or if you're speaking to peers or to an audience of equals with yourself. All right, let's move on to the third person then. Third person discourse emphasizes content. It puts the subject, the issue at the forefront. It is more formal and therefore the more distant, in fact the most distant of all persons. Your audience identifies less with you when you use third person. So third person is useful when it is necessary to maintain objectivity. That's why reporters will often use third person almost exclusively, unless their column calls for a little bit more opinionation. Third person is the realm of textbooks, science projects, history reports. Third person also enables us to establish authority, which is why the younger a person is, the more he should use third person. The older you become, the more you are able to use first or second person. That's why teachers urge their students to use third person, because of the authority that it lends to what you're saying. Now there is an inverse relationship, as we mentioned before. There's an inverse relationship between distance and identification. The greater distance, the less an audience identifies. So we find an inverse relationship between intimacy and authority. The more intimacy between speaker and audience, the less authority that there is. All right? Now, of course, an older preacher wants his audience to identify with him and with what he's saying. And so he may try to be a little bit cozier, depending on what he's trying to do. If he's trying to encourage, he most certainly wants his audience to identify with him. If he's trying to proclaim and preach and urge a course of action, then he will want to remove himself a little bit more and preach, "Thus saith the Lord." So this is something you need to understand. The greater the intimacy, the less the authority. The greater the authority, the less the intimacy. If you want to highlight your relationship to the audience, use first or second person, or both. If you need to highlight the speaker and the speaker and audience's relationship to the issue, so the way that the speaker and audience both relate to the issue, then you use third person. Sharon Crowley gives 3 examples of third person, and I'm going to use these examples to show you that even within the third person, sometimes the third person feels cozy or cozier than others. So some examples of third person discourse will seem more distant than others. That's what I want to show you. Let me start with this first passage. I want you to listen to it and then just notice what comes to the forefront. The great aim of the struggle for liberty has been equality before the law. This equality under the rules which the state enforces may be supplemented by a similar equality of the rules that men voluntarily obey in their relations with one another. This extension of the principles of equality to the rules of moral and social conduct is the chief expression of what is commonly called the democratic spirit, and probably that aspect of it that does most to make inoffensive the inequalities that liberty necessarily produces. That was a mouthful, and you probably noticed that it was an earful as well. The first example uses abstracts and nominalizations, verbs that are turned into nouns, nouns that are turned into verbs, nouns and adjectives turned into verbs. Abstract concepts are speaking and doing. Principles of equality express the democratic spirit, the article said, the passage said. These principles make the inequalities of liberty inoffensive. Well, actually, principles don't actually do anything. Principles are held, believed, carried out, practiced consistently, and so on. But they don't express anything. But he gives these abstract concepts a personal quality. They are the actors. Abstract concepts are the actors in the passage. The passage has great authority, but it's very difficult to identify with what the author is saying. And there are probably some other things you would probably have said if I were having a discussion with you about how you felt about that passage. You would probably say, "It lost me. You lost me on the second sentence." And that's because of the language that's used in that passage. All right, now let's notice this second example of third-person discourse. Writing about cooperation and solidarity means writing at the same time about rejection and mistrust. Solidarity involves individuals being ready to suffer on behalf of the larger group, and they're expecting other individual members to do as much for them. It is difficult to talk about these questions coolly. They touch on intimate feelings of loyalty and sacredness. Anyone who has accepted trust and demanded sacrifice, or willingly given either, knows the power of the social bond. Whether there is a commitment to authority or a hatred of tyranny, or something between the extremes, the social bond itself is taken to be something above question. Attempts to bring it out into the light of day and to investigate it are resisted, yet it needs to be examined. Everyone is affected directly by the quality of trust around him or her. All right, now there's the passage. What did you notice in that passage? Well, the first thing you might have noticed is that it feels more personal than the first passage. but you might not know why. The first passage only speaks of abstract concepts. Abstract concepts perform all the action. The second speaks of people, uses words like everyone, people, anyone, individuals, and so on. It speaks of people in the third person, but it still speaks of people. People are present, and that's why it feels more personal. Now, both examples, the first and second, use the third person exclusively, but the second example gives you, it reduces the distance that is natural to the third person. Now, Sharon Crowley takes the second example and rewrites it, this time using the first person. All right, so listen to the second example, but this time using first person. If I write about cooperation and solidarity, I must write at the same time about rejection and mistrust. I define solidarity as the readiness of individuals to suffer on behalf of the larger group, and they're expecting other individual members to do as much for them. I have difficulty talking about these questions coolly because they touch on intimate feelings of loyalty and sacredness. Since I have accepted trust and demanded sacrifice and have willingly given them as well, I know the power of the social bond. I take the social bond to be above question. My commitment to authority or my hatred of tyranny are irrelevant to this question. Every time I attempt to bring it out into the light of day and to investigate it, people resist my efforts. Yet we need to examine it because all of us are affected by the quality of trust around us. Now, in that third example, you can relate to the author quite easily. The author makes it very easy because the author uses first person. You feel spoken to in that last example. One more thing. When a person wishes to take responsibility for what they're saying or for their actions, they use first person. And that was evident in the passage that I just read. When it is the author's purpose to deflect responsibility, they will use third person. Let me use a simple example of an apology. Here are two different apologies. Listen to both. I should have treated you better than that. Please forgive me. The second, mistakes were made in the handling of this matter, and an apology is in order. Now, the first apology sounds like an actual person actually did wrong to another real, actual person, and that the person who did wrong is taking responsibility for it. I should have treated you better than that. Please forgive me. You've taken responsibility. You did it. You're sorry for it. You say so. The second one, mistakes were made in the handling of this matter and an apology is in order. But you notice no apology is actually offered. And the speaker is not saying, I did wrong. We're not saying who did wrong. In the second example, one could argue that an admission of guilt was made, but no responsibility was taken for it. Now, you might think the second example would never be appropriate, but you'd be mistaken about that. There is a time to deflect responsibility. Number one, if you really are not the person who did it, but what was done was wrong, and you don't wish to throw someone under the bus for what was done. So there's an admission of guilt without assigning guilt to any particular person. If you're trying to shield the person who did it, by the way, the Bible says that love covereth a multitude of sins. There is a time and there is a place for you not to reveal who did wrong for the sake of the wrongdoer. so that the wrongdoer has the ability to overcome the wrong that he did. So you're not willing to throw that person under the bus. There are also cases where wrong was done, but you do not know who did it. You don't know who to assign guilt to. But you feel that an apology is in order. And so you offer up somewhat of an apology, or at least you acknowledge that an apology is in order. Much could be said about this. We'll move on. The second element of language and of style that we need to consider, the next element that affects voice and rhetorical distance, is verb tense and voice. We'll talk about that next.